everyone, welcome back to the REST API in-depth series. In this video, we're going to go over post requests together when it comes to REST APIs. I'm super excited about this video. This is going to be the first time that we're actually going to be reaching into our backend and asking it to create some new data. Up until now, we've mainly been dealing with how to actually grab data out of our backend, like with GET requests, for example. But we're going to finally start to see the power of how REST APIs work when we can actually reach back into it and actually manipulate and change data. This is actually going to be what we're going to be doing over the next few videos with post requests, then the put and patch requests, and then the delete requests. But really, when it comes to manipulating data, this type of request, which is the post request that we're doing in this video, is probably the central premise for really understanding all the other types of requests when it comes to manipulating or changing data. I really want you to think about this like from a high level, like philosophically, I guess, when you're going through this video. Just kind of realize that this is us finally changing data, okay? As opposed to just reading data, we can actually write back to the data that we're manipulating. And this can be in a database, it can be in a file, it can be wherever. And that is a whole set of series for other videos on how to deal with database and things like that. But definitely keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this video together. Let's just get right to the content. Okay, so to start, I just want to go over an overview of post requests when it comes to the context of post requests to the other types of requests. So in the previous video, we saw GET requests, which was a way to grab data from the server and read that data, which is the R in CRUD. In post requests, it's again one of the HTTP methods. All of the ones I have on the right here are the other HTTP methods that we're going to be going through in this series. There are other methods as well. However, these are the most common ones. So a post request is really the C in the CRUD, the acronym CRUD, C-R-U-D. It's creating a new resource. So whenever you think of posts in the context of REST API, think about creating something. I want to create a new resource. I want to create a new user. I want to create a new movie. I want to create a new note or something like that. Now, the difference between post requests and GET requests, if you remember with GET requests, all of the data that we were asking questions about was in the actual URL itself. So we would do things like slash like movies and then like a movie ID, for example. When it comes to a post request, it's structured quite differently because we actually are creating a new resource from scratch. So we actually need to provide to the backend, to our kind of API layer. In this case, we're using Deno. We have to tell our API what it is that we want to create. So we have to provide that information somewhere, and the URL is not really the best place to provide that information because there's different types of information such as binary data, which we'll look at maybe in the exercises, that doesn't really fit very well into a URL parameter. So we need to deal with a request body, which is going to be a central premise of all these types of requests that deal with manipulating data in the next couple of videos. So the way to think about this is we're going to be posting, we're going to make a post request, we're going to post to a specific URL endpoint. So for example, we're using the URL pattern API, we create a route, we're going to post to that route, and that route is responsible to grab the information from the body and actually create that resource. So let's look at a visual of how that works, just so it makes a bit more sense. So imagine that this is us over here on the left-hand side, beautiful pictures. I hope you appreciate them. The middle here is kind of simulating the network, maybe the internet, or in this case, our local network on our machines as we're doing the development. So this is meant to demonstrate that on the right side, we have our server. On the left side, we have a client, and the client is going to be asking to create some new resource. Instead of asking a question to get a resource, like with the GET request, we're going to be asking to create a resource with a post request. So for example, in this visual, I have, please create a user, and I give the user details. So for example, in this case, the details are right here in the form of JSON. Now, I do want to kind of make a caveat. There are many other types of ways to provide data to a API. This even goes beyond REST APIs in general. We're going to be dealing with kind of JSON bodies in the context of this series of videos because that's probably what we're most familiar with, and it's pretty prevalent and common. However, there are many other ways to provide data back and forth between the servers and the clients. This is just one of the more common ones. So that said, here we have our JSON body, we're saying, please create a user with these fields. In this case, there's a username field with the string monkey, there's the age field with the number 20, and there's the country field with the string Germany. Okay, so we're asking the server, the API, to please create this user for us, assuming this user doesn't exist. All right, so what does the server do? Well, if all goes well, the server is going to be like, okay, thank you for this information. I'm going to create this new resource for you, in this case, a user. And the server is usually going to assign some kind of unique ID to that resource so it can kind of keep track of things behind the scenes. So this would allow us to, for example, have multiple users if we wanted to that might have the username monkey. So we could have duplicate records, but the IDs might be different. So that's one strategy we can use, and it's a pretty common one. So notice, though, in this diagram, that we do not provide the ID when we're creating the resource. It is not the client's job to do this. In fact, there could be a lot of issues if we allow the client to choose the ID when it comes to dealing with kind of how the IDs are generated and a bunch of the backend database stuff when it comes to the server. So it's the server's job to create any extra fields necessary for the management of that resource among the other resources. The client just needs to be able to ask, hey, can you please create this user? And here's the information for the user. That's all they need to ask. If you think about it, that kind of makes sense. I just want to create a user. Here's a name, here's the age, here's some information, and then kind of like deal with all the rest of the stuff at the back end when it comes to the server itself. Okay, so here is an example of how that might work with a little bit of kind of more diagramming here. So we would make a post request as opposed to a get request to a specific endpoint for this resource. So in our get request videos, we saw that we would do something like get user or get movie or get movies, and we could return one or many resources. We could even add things like filters through query parameters. When it comes to posting resources, generally we're just going to have an endpoint that we post to. Now, it also gets kind of tricky with the naming conventions, and this is a little bit of an art mixed with a little bit of science. You could make the argument that, hey, Nader, this doesn't make sense. Can we post to users, plural, instead of user? Absolutely, right? Does that make sense? Up to you. I'm not really sure, right? It really depends on how you actually make your API and design the rest of your API. The main thing is to be consistent. Like, do I want to post to book or books, right? If I'm creating a single book. So it really is up to you. I kind of like the reading, I guess, of the fact that I'm creating a single user. So I'm going to be posting to user singular, but again, it's up to you. So this would be the endpoint that we're posting to, and this is the URL pattern that we'd be creating on the back end, in this case in Deno, to actually catch that request and grab the data out of it so that we can do something with it. So the data is going to be this data right here in this example. There's going to be a body attached to the request. This is not going to be in the URL. Notice the URL is very, very stripped down. It's very simple. We're just saying /user. If this was a GET request, this wouldn't really make sense because a user singular is kind of implying a single user. So the question would be then, okay, like which user am I getting? Usually we'd have like a /ID or, / something else, or we'd have a filter or something. So this only makes sense in the context of a post request where we're creating a new resource, in this case, a user. So we're creating this user right here, which is going to be the JSON information contained inside the request's body coming into the server, username with a string, age with a number, country with a string. And this is kind of the way to think about it. Create a user, C for CRUD in the CRUD operations, create a user with this information right here. And the server is going to go and do that, and it's going to respond with this user. It's going to respond with the ID that it generated or any extra fields it might have generated, just so that we know it was actually something that the server correctly did. And it's going to give us back, as we saw over here, a 201, which is a status for created. Now, is it always going to be an ID, or is it going to be a number? Those details are not really relevant. It really depends on what kind of database you're using, the structure of all the other data. The main thing is we're going to get something back from the server to acknowledge that that resource was created, and we're going to see the data that we passed in right here is in fact the same data that we passed in right here. There might be some extra information like this ID. Okay, now there's some other things that kind of you might be thinking that might go wrong with this scenario, and we'll get to that in a second. But before we get to that, I just want to switch over to VS Code so we can actually see this in practice because it's definitely a lot of fun to actually see how this works in actual code. So I'll switch over to VS Code over here. I'm going to create a new file over here. I'll call this post and I'll do .ts. And then this is just a regular TypeScript file. I want to create a Deno project here. So if I do Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and I type Deno, we can do Deno enable. This is the newer version of the initialized workspace configuration from the older versions of Deno. I'll do that, and it's going to create a little VS Code settings.json folder for me over there. And now I can actually start typing in here. So I'm going to say async function handler, and this is going to take a request of type request, and we're going to return a new response, and in this case I'll just do null, and for now I'll just give it a status of 404 just so that we make sure that that's working, and I don't want to accidentally return a 200 or 201 if we're not doing anything correct. Here I'll do Deno .serve, and I'll serve the handler function right here, and we can see that that's going to be on port 8000 on localhost, or you can use this IP address as well if you like. So I'll save that. I'll open my terminal here. I'm going to make sure I'm in the correct folder. I'll do an ls. There I am with my post.ts. I'm going to do Deno run watch. For now, we're going to have to add some function, some flags right after this to make this actually work properly. So we'll see that shortly, but I'll add that in a second, and I'll do post.ts. And we'll see that, oh, I forgot to add -- listen. So you can see that there's a warning here because we are using the server. Totally slipped my mind. So it's asking, do you want to allow Deno listen? I'm actually going to redo that command just so you can see me type that out. So I'll actually bring that command up again. I'll move my cursor over here, and I'll add a allow -net. Because we want to be able to allow Deno to access the ports, which is what our handler is doing in this case. We at least have to have that. And there we go. We have our port 8000. So it just shows that the permissions are working as intended with Deno, which is great. We do need to add some more permissions shortly. So now if I open up Insomnia, I'm going to create a new HTTP request. I'll click the plus sign, HTTP request over here. I'll go back to my VS Code. I'll just copy this URL so I don't have to type it out. And I'll switch back to Insomnia, paste that in, click send, and I do get my 404, which is perfect. So that works quite nicely. Now, what do we need to do here to actually do a post request? Well, we need a place to store that data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file over here on the left. Now let's go with kind of the example that we saw with the actual kind of slides that I had up. I'm going to create a users.json file. All right, now in this file, I'm just going to simply create an empty array. Okay. Actually, you know what? Let's put a user in here just so we can actually see what that looks like. So I'll put a single object in here, and we'll kind of go with exactly what we had over here. So we're going to have a username, an age, and a country. So I'll switch back over here. So I'll say username, and the username. Let's just go very simple. We'll go with Bob. And then we'll have an age. Recall that this is JSON. This is not a JavaScript object, so everything needs to be in quotes for the keys, and then the values have to be in quotes, double quotes for the strings, or we can do integers. So in this case, for example, let's just say Bob is 50, and then country for Bob might be, let's just say like Mexico. Perfect. So I'll save that, and that's Bob right there. So that's our first user in this JSON array. Now you might be thinking, well, shouldn't we have an ID in here? And you'd be correct. So let's actually add that, and I'll mention why in a second. So I'm going to add an ID here, and Bob is our very first user. So I'll give Bob the wonderful ID of number 1, the best player, Bob. Why did I choose 1? Doesn't really matter. You'll see different types of ID schemes. Sometimes it's like an auto-incrementing integer, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes it'll be just a totally random set of numbers and letters, or just numbers. It can be really anything. The main thing is that this should be unique, generally speaking, because the database, in this case, our file system is going to, or our code that deals with this file is going to have to know that there could be like another Bob, for example, with the same information. That's a totally, I'm sure there's more than one Bob from Mexico who's 50. We would need a different ID. Okay, so an ID of 2 or an ID of 3. Now, let's switch back to our code here and let's read in that file. So at the very top here, I'm going to actually, you know what, instead of doing it at the top here, I'm going to do it inside of this handler, and you'll see why in a second. In fact, we're gonna have to move this a little bit, but you'll see why. So I'm gonna say const users, or actually I'll say file, is equal to await Deno. Let me just close this sidebar for a second. Deno.read text file. I'll put a string of users.json. That was hard to type for some reason. And then I'll say const users is equal to json.parse of our file. So we're going to read our file as a string. We're going to turn that into a nice JSON object. And then we're actually going to be able to use that object just so we can see how that works. Console.log, not .assert of our users. So watch what happens. If I save this file, I'll save it. I'll open up my terminal over here. Actually, Deno didn't prompt me for that. But what'll happen is if I try to probably close this and probably run this again, it's because the handler doesn't run until I actually try to request something from the server. So watch what happens. I'm going to run this file. The watcher started. I'm going to switch over to Insomnia, try to make a request. It's going to hang over here. Okay, and the reason is if I switch back to my VS Code, you'll see that Deno is trying to read from this JSON file, but we didn't give it the -- allow read permission. So I'm going to close that server, and I'm going to kind of bring up that previous command with the -- allow net. I'm going to add to this command. You can just retype the whole thing if you like. I'm just going to add to it here -- allow -read. And I'm going to do that, and it's going to start that process. So allow net is for the ports, allow read is for that file. And now if I make this request, instead of getting an error, I should get back my 404, and we should see the log of this JSON file right here, which is quite nice. Perfect. So that works correctly. Now, that's all just set up. How do we make a post request to actually add something to this list of users? Well, we're going to create a route. Okay, if you think about what we had over here, we had a post route for /user. If I switch back here, let's go ahead and do that using the URL pattern API. So I'm going to create a const create user route, and I'll just close this terminal for a second, is equal to a new URL pattern, and this is going to have a path name of /user. All right. Now we do also want to make sure this is a post request as opposed to a get request for /user. So I'm going to say if I also need to create a URL here for a second. So I'll say const URL is equal to a new URL of our request.url. We've seen this in the previous videos, just so it splits it into its requisites, path names and hash and all that kind of stuff if it's in there. If our create user route matches, so tests against our URL. So if that's the URL that we're asking for, and the requests method is equal to post now instead of get, then we want to create a new user. That's what we want to do. All right. So let's test this out. So I'll say console.log creating user. And I'll open up my terminal here. Let's see if we get that console log. So if I switch back to my get request here, if I do a get request to /user and I send that off, do we have the log? No, that's great. But if I switch that to a post request here and I send that off, we should see that log creating user, and we do, so that's pretty great. So that means we're actually correctly detecting both the path and the method type, which is wonderful. Okay, so here is where things get fun. We need to provide the server with the information for that new user. If you think about it, if you go back here, we had to provide this somewhere because we can't just say post to user with no information, because what user are we creating? We can't just generate random information. That doesn't really make sense in the case of this API at least. So where do we provide this information? This is provided in the request body. Okay, I'm going to switch over to Chrome really quick and Google. I'm going to say request object MDN, and I'll pull that up in the web APIs over here. And if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that one of the properties of the request is the request.body. So if I click on that, you can see that if we were to use the request object like this, for example, for the fetch API, which is pretty common on in JavaScript, we could provide a body like this. In this case, it's just a simple string. But a lot of the time, we'll be providing either like a form or we'll be providing a JSON kind of formatted information. So we need to actually grab this body or provide this body to start and then grab it on the back end. Now, we can do that in the fetch API, very similar to this, or with API clients like Insomnia and other ones, you can actually finally see that we're going to start using this body tab over here. So we switch over to this body tab. You can click the little drop down beside it, and you can see that we have multiple different types of bodies that we can submit to our API. Now, we'll go through some of these. You can see that there is a whole bunch of different types of options, including binary data, which is pretty awesome. But we're going to be, for now, for this video, focusing on JSON. I will mention things like form url-encoded and multipart form, which are the most common ones from front-end clients, for example, as well in a second. But let's just start with JSON for now. So if I click on JSON for body, what we'll see is now I have a place to type in JSON. So this has to be properly formatted JSON, just like we had in our file. Now, we want to submit a single user. So this is, for example, the user we want to submit. Recall that we don't submit the ID. Okay, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's actually take this exact user and try to create this user. So username monkey, age of 20, country of Germany. So if I switch back to Insomnia, let's kind of type that out. We're going to have a username of monkey. We're going to have an age of 20, and we're going to have a country of Germany. Perfect. So you can also click and beautify that if you kind of have the formatting bit off, so it looks kind of like this. I should probably make that a little bit bigger. Oh, but puts it to the bottom. I think that you can see that. Yeah, that should be good. I think you can see that there. So there's our JSON body. You can see that we're posting to /user up here. Maybe I'll move this over a little bit so you can see that. And what we're going to, actually I can move this there. I don't actually really need all those. What we're going to do is make this request to our server. So I'm gonna do post to /user with this JSON body, and I'll click send, and nothing happens. Okay. So if I come back in here though, and I switch back to here, you can see that we are back in the creating user section. So how do we get access to that body from our server? So that is going to be in the body property. So if we actually take a look at the request.body parameter, it's a property of the request interface. It has a stream of the body contents. Request using get or head method cannot have a body, which I mentioned earlier, so it will return null. But since we're using a post request, we should be able to grab that body using request.body. In this case, the request that we have on our server side. So let me switch back to VS Code. I'm going to say const body is equal to req, which is our request up here. Recall that that's our request right there, dot, and then you can see that we have a whole bunch of different options. Body is one of them. So if I grab that, let's log it out and see what happens. Console.log of body. Perfect. So I'll save that. Our server is going to restart. I'll switch back to Insomnia. I'll click on send, and I'll switch back to VS Code. And we have a readable stream, lot false. Okay, now this is what I want to kind of mention, because this is something that we can get really tripped up with when we're first working with kind of the vanilla Deno APIs, or you're not working with something like, say, Express or Oak or something like that. The body by default, as we can see, is a readable stream. Now, this is actually a really important and useful feature of working with like binary data, for example, and streaming data. There's a lot of very powerful things we can do with this. Now, we don't need all that power right now. We're actually just assuming that our request is submitting textual data, so text data as string data, to our server. So there's actually a shortcut, so we don't have to really deal with all this streaming stuff with encoders and decoders and encodings. We can actually just use a property on the request object to grab text out of it. Now, I do want to caveat this, but I want to show you this because it's really important to know there's a lot of power behind the scenes, and we're going to need to see this when working with binary data. But it's important to also know that there are shortcuts we can take if we can make certain assumptions about our data. So let me show you what I mean. If I go back to Chrome over here, we saw that request body is a property that we can get the body of the request. But if I just go back a step, we can look at another set of instance methods on this request object. We can see that there's in this case, where is it? Instance properties. So we have request dot, where is it that I want to show you? HIJKLM. Oh, here it is. Sorry, it is instance methods. I'm going a bit crazy. So we have request.text and we have request.json, request.form data. Form data I'm going to show you in a future slide, because that's going to be really important when we're actually dealing with forms that are coming from the client. But we know that we have JSON data or text data. So instead of grabbing the body off of that, let's take a look at what we can do. So we can say request dot, and I can say JSON, just like that. So if I do this, we can see that this takes a response stream and reads it to completion and returns a promise that resolves with the result of parsing the body text as JSON. We could have also done request.text, but since we know that our body is actually formatted in JSON, we're just going to assume for this video that it is actually JSON, because this does the extra step of actually turning it back into a JSON object for us, so we don't have to do the whole JSON stringify and parse and all that kind of fun stuff. So in this case, we're going to just say request.json, which is a method, not a property. So that's where I just got myself confused. It is a instance method where we're converting the request bodies string into a JSON object for us. And we can see that we can turn it into text or form data as well. So if I switch back to VS Code here and I kind of save that and restart the server, let's switch back to Insomnia. We'll try that again, see if instead of a readable stream this time, we just get the text data for the JSON that we're interested in. I'll click on send, switch back to VS Code, and we can see that I have a promise pending because this is actually returning a promise, as you can see. So I do have to await this. So if I do await over here and then I resave that and I switch back to Insomnia, try this one more time. Now it should work, fingers crossed. I'll switch back to VS Code and we do get back our JSON object with the username monkey, age 20, and country Germany. Now, you could probably be thinking, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work to get this working. This is why a lot of people do use libraries to simplify a lot of this stuff. However, the point of this series is really to get an intuitive understanding for how this all works behind the scenes, and actually working with some of the lower level details of a lot of the web standard APIs. For example, the request API and the response API are absolutely crucial to understanding how pretty much every single framework, no matter which one you use, actually works behind the scenes, because they're all using this behind the scenes anyways. So let's switch back over here, and now we have access to the actual request body. So think about this for a second. This is pretty remarkable. We have access to the body that was passed to us from the client. The client is actually giving us information so that we can work with it and add it to our, in this case, database, which is our text file. And with that text file, we can actually take this and create an ID and insert monkey into our text file as a new user. So that's the next step. Let's see how that would actually work. So in this case, our body is going to be our user. So I can probably kind of rename this to user just so it makes a little bit more sense. So I'll do that. That's our user request.json. I'll get rid of the log there. And also get rid of this log here just so that we can have a bit cleaner space. And now what we want to do is we want to add this user to our users.json file. So we need to generate an ID for this user because it doesn't come with an ID. This is actually a very crucial step. I'm going to do something really basic, which is absolutely not encouraged at all, because we do want to make sure there's no clashes in the IDs or duplicates. Normally, if you're dealing with something like a database, it takes care of this for you behind the scenes and it makes sure there's no clashing. I'm not going to bother with that for now. I'm just going to show you just at a very high level how this might work. So for example, I'll just create an ID. This might be something like math.random. Maybe I'll just create an ID between 1 and 1,000. So one easy way to do this is like math.floor of math.random. Let me just close this over here, times 1,000, just like that. And if I do that, I'll just create a random ID between I think like 0 and 999 or 1 and 1000. I always mix those numbers up, always off by 1. And now we can use that as the ID for our user. So what we can do is now we can say, actually what I can probably do is I can just turn this let user, and then I can say user is now equal to, I'll spread out everything in the previous user, and then, or I can add the ID at the start or at the end. It doesn't really matter. I can do that at the very start. I'll add the ID at the very start and then the rest of the user over there. So now I'm adding that ID into this user object, which I can then save to my file. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky. The way that we're working with files, we need to make sure we have the most updated version of the file to actually write to. If you think about it, if I had, let's take this information over here. If I had this read operation happen like outside of this handler, for example, up here, I'm doing that at the very start of this script running, but I'm not rereading the file in every time this handler gets hit. So we want to be careful with that because we'd have stale information inside of that user's JSON in this case. So we actually want to move this set of information to where we actually need it as close as possible. That makes sense. It probably makes sense over here for now, but I'm actually going to move it down here just like this because I want to make sure that I'm getting the latest information for that user's file only when we're actually requesting to add a new user, because it could be possible that someone else added a user or changed that file like a second right before I did. I want to make sure I have the correct information and I'm not overriding their information or getting the wrong information into the file. So now I have the updated users, which is the users from this file. I want to basically add my user down here, right? The new user that I just created. So how do I do that? Well, the easiest way to do that is actually to do the same thing. We know that users is going to be an array of users. So I'm going to say, I'm actually just going to create this as a let as well, just so that we can actually add to it. And I'm going to say users is now equal to, I'm going to put everything in there before, that was in the users before, plus the new user at the very end, which is the user that we just created with the ID. So I could probably have done this. I could say like I could have said const user, and I could say like const new user, for example, like that, if that makes more sense. So I user, maybe this makes more sense, user body, like that. So I could create a new user and take the information from the actual request, add the ID that we just generated, and then take our users array, add it to the array, and then save that back to the actual file. So the final step is going to be deno.write write text file, and we want to write our users. But users is a object, a JSON object. So we're actually have to do json.stringify to turn it into a string, because we can only write text strings back to a file. So in this case, for a write text file, we also have to provide the path to the file. I totally forgot about that. So our path in this case is going to be users.json, just like that. And the data that we need to write to the file is going to be JSON stringify. So if you think about it, reading a file, we don't actually need to specify anything. We just want to read that file in, write into the file, spell that correctly to make sure. We want to write to this file, this data, which is our new user added to the array of all the previous users. So the expectation here is that we will see our new user added to the end of this file right after this user, and the more that we add, the more that we should see at the end of this file. Now, we'll just await this actually, because I do want to assign this, or I want to be able to respond to this after it's been submitted correctly, because we can catch some errors, for example, if this actually works, and then we can return a new response here. And that response is actually going to be our new user, if you think about it, because we created an ID, we added that to this new user, we saved that to the end of that user array, we put that back into the text file. After that's done, then we want to update the user on the front end, the client that submitted this information up here in the first place, that this was successfully added with that new ID. So we can say json.stringify of our new user that was added, and we can say the status here is going to be 201 that user was created. All right, so if I save this and I open my terminal for a second, I'm going to show you one thing that we're going to run into with Deno permission. So if I come back to Insomnia and I send this off, this is going to spin again. And the reason is, if I switch back here, it's going to say that we want write access to users.json. So I'm going to close off this by doing Control-C. I'm going to bring up my previous command, Deno run --watch --allow net --allow read. We also need a --allow -write operation. So we need a read and write privileges. Now you might be looking at this again and being like, oh my gosh, like why do I have to type all these --? And you'd be correct for the most part. It's important to know what it is your program is doing and what it has access to. This is something really we start taking for granted in modern programming. But if you actually go back and you start to learn some of this stuff, you actually realize that there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes. And this helps you kind of put things in context in your brain as to, oh yes, this program is reading to the file system. It's writing from the file system. It's actually opening up ports on the file system. This is something that the more that you do this, the more that you gain an appreciation for, and it really helps in pretty much all parts of programming, not just this type of development. So I'll run that with the allow write flag added there, post.ts. Watch, our process has started. All right, fingers crossed. So we have our users.json file here. What we expect is if I submit this JSON data with username, age, and country for Monkey 20 and Germany respectively to our backend server, what we're going to see is it added to the end of this list here of users. So we have Bob in here right now. I'm going to switch to Insomnia. I'm going to click on send. Oh my gosh, look at that. We have a 201 created. We created an ID. You'll notice that this ID is not in our request. Okay, so we generated a random ID here with our random math floor of 315 for username monkey. Thankfully, we didn't choose 1, which would have been a 1 in 1,000 chance, and it would have been a duplicate. You will get a different number as you do this, most likely. And we will see this user hopefully inside of our text file. If I switch back to VS Code and I save this file and reformat it and close my Deno for a second, look at that. We have our ID of 315 username monkey age 20 country Germany in there. Now, just for sweetness sake, I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to add another username. Let's say this is going to be banana. Banana is going to be, let's say banana is 200-year-old banana, and it's, let's just say from Brazil. And if I send this off, I expect banana to be in there with a new ID and all the correct information. If I switch back to VS Code, I'll save this for the prettier to reformat it. We can see that that's also been added to our server. Now, that is super awesome. Check this out. This is why this is so important. If I close this server, the server is cut off. But our file persists, right? This is why we are creating resources. Our users file, our database still has this information. The next time I start up this process for this server, this is the information that it's now working with. These users have actually been permanently added to our database. If we need to remove them, we will have to do different operations that are not post requests to actually get rid of those users, which we'll see in future videos. Shockingly, you can imagine what the name for that type of request would be. So this is really the core of what it means to create a post request. I'm just going to go through this one more time before I kind of go through a couple of other slides to kind of wrap up this video. The point of a post request is to create a resource on our server. In this case, we're asking our server, can you please create a new user in your kind of users database or set of users? Notice that the client doesn't know anything about how this process is done. It's just assuming that it's creating a new user. And in the future, if we were to get that user using GET request, we would expect that user to be there with that new ID that was created. So we're going to create that user. The backend in this case is going to grab that in that route. For a post request, it's going to grab all the users that it needs to. It's going to parse out the actual body create an ID, in this case, a very bad ID. You shouldn't do this in production, but this is a very quick and dirty way to grab an ID. You probably use a UUID or an auto incrementing ID. We're going to add that ID to that user object. Then we're going to add that user object or whatever resource to that list of resources that we had before. If this was a database, this would be handled kind of a bit more seamlessly for us, but we're doing it manually in JavaScript with a JSON file. Then we're going to save that. This is like committing it or saving it back to the file. In this case, writing it back to that file. We're reading the old file, putting in the new user, writing in the new file with that new user in there. So now it's permanently saved to our users.json file. And then we're sending back to our client, good job, 201, that was created. Here is your new user information, which is JSON stringified right here. And we actually see that right over here with that new ID and a 201 status. So that is this entire process right here. We just built this from scratch in Deno, which is pretty remarkable if you think about how that whole process works. Now, this is why it's so important to really have kind of good mental model for how this works. If you can kind of wrap your mind around that, I know it might take a little while. There's a lot of code going on in there, a lot of funny stuff with the requests and the response and things like that. But once you kind of wrap your mind around it, you can really see how this can pretty much apply to anything. The only thing we're really missing right now is the ability to reach in and change some existing data, which we'll see in the put and patch videos, and also to delete the users or delete any resource, which we'll see in the delete videos. So this concept, though, is actually the same concept for those types of requests as well. We're going to reach in, check the request method, and we're going to do something with the data and then let the client know that either that thing was done or was not done. Now, before we finish off this video, I do want to mention a couple of important caveats. I want to show you what I mean by some things that could go wrong. So imagine we do a post request to user using exactly what we had. But the body, in this case, this body right here that the client submits, remember the client can submit anything that they want. Imagine that they submit this data, age and country. Okay, now, that is probably not good, right? Because maybe they forgot to put a username. Maybe the user in this form or something forgot to enter the username and it wasn't correctly validated. We don't want to allow this, or we want to be able to allow or not allow certain types of data in our backend. Imagine if we accidentally save this with an ID to our actual database, to our file. That would be really confusing, right? Because then we would be getting back data that is technically malformed or not correct. In this case, we'd be getting like an ID, an age, and a country with no username. So we would want to be able to allow or disallow certain types of fields using data validation. So you can imagine that what we could do for this is we would just respond with a bad request. We would not respond with a 201 in this case if for example, it's missing any of the validated fields. We'll go deeper into this in the exercises, but you can imagine that before we actually go ahead and write that to our file or even read in the file in the first place, we would want to do some validation over here on the user body, right? So we would want to do some validate the user here. Right? We'd want to make sure we do that. We could check to see that that is one of the keys in that JSON object. For example, if it's a required field, we want to make sure username is one of the fields in there. And we could add and remove required fields over time. We could have optional fields. Now, another thing that might come into play here is not only the fact that the field itself might be missing, but something like this, where the field might be there, but it might be the wrong type. So in this case, for example, country is the number 5. Maybe it's encoded as numbers, maybe it's an ID for a country, but let's assume that it should be a string. Now, this is technically the correct fields that we have in there, but the values are incorrectly formed, right? In this case, specifically the values for country. So similar to what I just mentioned about making sure the fields exist, not only that, we want to make sure that when the field exists, that the value for that field is the correct value that we expect. So the type of the value for the country key in this case should be a string. And if it's not a string, we do want to mention 400 bad requests, probably send back an error to the client saying, hey, please, country must be a string. I think you messed that up. Try again. And we really want to have helpful error messages in there so that the client doesn't just get a sorry, the request failed, which I'm sure you've seen before using different types of APIs. We want to be as helpful as possible. and send back a detailed error message, ideally a JSON object with an error key that has all the different errors listed in there. Country must be a string, or a username is missing, or a whole bunch of things that might be off with the actual validation. We do not want to save this data to our database or to our file if it doesn't pass all the validation steps. So only after the validation is saved should we even bother doing any of this stuff over here. Okay, it doesn't make sense to do any of this stuff or even read in the file, frankly, unless the body is actually correct. Okay, now to wrap up the video, I want to go over a really interesting topic, and this is going to set us up really nicely for the exercises. There are many different types of encoding types that we can put inside the body, or even just in general in the request itself. So what do I mean by this? If you saw the body previously, before we did this thing where we said, hey, please assume it's JSON or please assume it's text, you might have noticed things like form data over here and blob and array buffers and things like that. It turns out that we can actually put all sorts of data and format all types of data inside the body, not just as JSON. So in this case, we are sending JSON data to our API. But there are other ways to send data to the API as well. I have a couple of the more pronounced ones here, because these are the ones that you'll see appear in most clients: multipart form data, form URL encoded data in GraphQL, which is probably going to have to be a separate series. We're using JSON, form URL encoded, and multipart form is really the interesting one. So JSON we saw already. The body can be formatted like this with JSON data. There's another type of data. Remember how I said that technically we can send kind of like a URL with all the information in it, and it would look kind of like this, which is like a funky version of a GET request. Technically you can do that. It's definitely less used. However, it is a thing that you might see out there where you can just put everything in the URL. For example, in this case, you can see that we basically shoved all this information into this URL right here. Now it gets a bit confusing with strings and numbers. Obviously, you can't do binary data very easily like this, at least, unless you encode it. But you'll see this sometimes used. I just wanted to mention that so you do know that it's there and you're aware of it if you do see it. However, definitely the most common one is JSON, like this one right here, but also you will see this one down here, which I have in purple, which is the multipart form data. Now, this is important because it allows us to submit forms, which is a very common practice for all types of applications, web apps and iOS, Android apps. We have all types of forms. Enter your information and submit that form to the server, and that can be encoded slightly differently if we need to. It doesn't have to be in JSON. JSON is not the only way to encode something. For example, if we put in a form for the same information here, monkey 20 in Germany, it would look like this. It would actually be separated automatically by the system into these different boundaries that are separated. And you can see we have monkey right here. We can have the age right here, which is right here. And we have Germany, which is a country right here on the bottom. Now, this might seem ultra confusing, and it kind of is with the first time that you see it. However, the real power behind this is we can make a very, very, very long form, and we can also add, most crucially, binary data to this form. We can actually submit things like images and files and all sorts of things like that as part of this type of setup, which we cannot do with JSON. If you think about this JSON, how would you submit easily something like a PDF file, right, or a image? It's not intuitive how you would actually do that with just numbers and letters, right? You could encode it, but that would get pretty complicated. We can actually directly put binary data into a form data object like this and submit it to the server and actually use it. We will see that in the exercises together to get more practice with it. It's a little bit more complex and it's definitely quite fun. And a hint I want to give you for that before you do the exercises, if you do get a chance, is hint, it has something to do with, just like we saw how the JSON object works with the request.json on the server side, where we actually turned it into a JSON right here. You can imagine that the form data is going to probably use something like this, and we can grab the form data out of it. This follows the form data API, which we actually saw in the DOM series as well, together as a React series. So that's a really, really nice thing about using these web standard APIs, is that it allows us to learn all parts of the web ecosystem, and they cross over quite a lot, and we can do pretty much anything we need to with most of these APIs. Okay, enough of me talking. That was really fun to put together. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you do want to support this work and future videos, feel free to check out the Patreon or YouTube memberships, or you can send me a super thanks. That would be great. What we're going to do in the next video is, as I mentioned, go over a bunch of exercises to get more practice with this idea of post requests together. We'll look at things like multi-part forms in there, as well as the JSON submissions. And then after that, we're going to look at the other types of requests, such as put, patch, and delete. I can't wait to get to those videos. I will see you there.